they were always there. I'm sure they were for you too. I mean, the songs are a part of the things we listened to before classic rock radio format came out. It was just music. I didn't really get it until sort of the tail end of my college career, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was everything I love about music. One thing is it's all the different kinds of music that I love. Blues, certain aspects of country, rhythm and blues and soul, rock and roll, jazz. It's all there in one package.
Maybe a little gospel.
There's a lot of gospel there too. Not a huge thing that I loved, but I get that from the rhythm and blues and soul side. But absolutely, the only thing it didn't have that is music that is part of my youth is punk rock, and that really wasn't around as such in '69 when they were forming. So I always say like they had it in attitude. They had punk rock in attitude. I'm going to pause for a sec while we get this overhead noise out of the way. The next thing is I am a huge fan of excellence. I whether it be a historian, which is my line of work, or an artist, or Michael Jordan, frankly, an athlete, something like that. It's just someone who's really, really, really good at their craft. It really appeals to me because I know it's not necessarily easy what they do and how to do it. So these guys, you could tell there was something really special going on. I pulled a quote, which I think you've referenced or you're going to, the very famous Bill Graham quote. It's not just that they played quantity. And for my amateur ears all my life, I've never heard the kind of music this group plays. And that was true for me. They were excellent musicians, all of them across the board, all six of the originals. The third thing I think is gets to the kind of core of, our friendship, if you will, and others that we know. I really think it's very cool that they are a collective that is individuals who are greater than the sum of their parts. Together they did something that they couldn't do without each other. When you listen to the original band, you can really hear it. They're not in competition. They're literally lifting each other up or lifting the song up or lifting it forward almost at all times, which is really, really pretty cool for me. I call it like they're supporting the conversation. And it was so cool for me to hear people so in sync, and I think if we're lucky, we get that maybe once in a lifetime, ourselves. It's something to strive for. So they just had everything for me. And they did it so damn well. So
when did you decide that this band was going to be the band or the thing that you wrote your doctoral thesis on? How did you come to that decision?
I pieced this together just recently. And in 96 or 97, I wrote a series of goals down. And one of those was to get a PhD and to write a book on the Allman Brothers Band. I couldn't have told you how I would get from there to here. It's been 20 years since I was able to do this. I don't have a book yet, but I've got a 500-page manuscript. I think part of it was my own discovery of saying, what is here that, why did this flick a switch for me, or flick a switch, frankly, for you or others of our friends who dig this band so much? It just became kind of a little piece of my life's work. I happen to be fortunate that I work in history. I've made a career of it. And so when I went back to graduate school the second time to get my PhD, 2013 is when I started. I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to devote the time and effort and energy to do this. And so this is a band that ticked every box for me. And I was like, what is it? And so I just decided to go figure it out, or try to at least put some words to it.
All of that stuff that you said about sort of coming into your own with the Allman Brothers, it registers with me. It was towards the end of my college career as well. And in particular, it was just really falling in love with the sound of Duane Allman's slide. I mean, that was the thing that finally put me over into being a fan to being I wanted to listen to them all the time. And I think it just speaks to their musicianship, but actually all of those guys were such great musicians. And I'm just curious, What can you tell us about Duane and Greg Allman as musicians? What were they doing before they came to the Allman Brothers Band?
It's interesting. This is a really good question. I think that the easy narrative, the narrative that has been out there, and it's very true. They were somewhat successful local musicians in Daytona Beach, Florida, where they lived. There's a really famous story. It's hard when you're dealing with the actual actors, if you will, historical actors. Their stories aren't always consistent, but Greg Allman was pretty consistent about the impetus for starting to play music. And it was a guy who, Greg says probably was, I don't know, special needs of some sort, probably Down syndrome or something, who had a guitar in Nashville when they were visiting their grandmother, and he showed Greg some chords. Same summer 1960, they go see a rhythm and blues review show headlined by Jackie Wilson, Otis Redding, B.B. King were there. And apparently Duane, according to Duane's daughter Galadriel, through her uncle Greg, was just absolutely mesmerized, just transfixed. And he literally turns to Greg and says, watching people just go nuts with the music, and he turns to Greg and says, "Little brother, we got to get into this." Which I think is just an awesome quote, because he's just like, dang, something's going on here. I need to follow this path. And they both started playing guitar. They formed local bands. It's a pretty cool story, which we won't get into here, but they were playing a lot of African-American clubs. They played in an integrated band there in Jacksonville, which, in the early 1960s is really not common. And they go to the black side of town and play after hours in the nightclubs where the black musicians couldn't play and those things. So they form a band and hit the road called the Allman Joys, a play on the candy bar name. And one of the things I looked at in my own research, that, this is how musicians start separating themselves. They play local and then they go on the road. And Greg and Duane, early on, it's mostly Duane, it seems. He was really the one pushing and said, we're going to do this. And, their peers recognized it right away. Tommy Tucker, who was a local there in Daytona Beach, said, the rest of us were just having a good time, squeezing out a living, playing on the weekends. The Allmans were professionals, which is a really interesting way to think about it. When, I don't know if you played in garage bands in high school or college. I certainly did. And, they were pursuing this from the get-go and from the beginning when they went through. And one of the things that is they were excellent musicians. But I will tell you, from this era, the more I've thought about this, even after writing my dissertation, they were cover artists, very, very, very proficient, covering the hits of the day, Beatles songs. And then most people mention they played the Yardbirds, which was, I guess, a mark of excellence and attainment for a lot of people in and around Florida and the South who had heard them. And, they formed the Allman Joys. Several members finally give it up eventually, and they joined forces with Johnny Sandlin and Paul Hornsby, who were in a band called the 5 Minutes with a guy named Eddie Hinton. They were Alabamians. So what you got is the sort of mix of these Florida kids, Duane and Greg, along with these kids from northwest Alabama around the Muscle Shoals area. And Eddie Hinton is a pretty famous name in this story. Never quite got the renown, very similar kind of path as Duane's, except Eddie Hinton went and was a studio musician most of the time in Muscle Shoals. For a long time he was. So they formed a band, and the story, I know, but I'll share it. They formed a band and get quote-unquote discovered by the manager of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. And they sign a contract, go out to L.A., and they become the Hourglass. I always show an image of them. I was in my notes, and when I do a talk, I always say they went and got dressed up, because every stereotype of mock pseudo hippie garb was the way they were dressed up. There's a really famous picture of Duane with essentially having a doily around his neck playing guitar on a TV show. That just makes me laugh, because here's a firebrand of a guitar player who's dressed up in pseudo Victorian finery, and it just doesn't match up. But again, the big issue is and I'm skipping a lot of parts of it, but Duane didn't ever write songs. He wasn't a singer. So he didn't have a lot to offer necessarily the record company. The record company naturally gravitated toward Greg as a front man and leader, pretty boy, the vocals, everything else. And Duane just hated it. And I'll get more to that because I think you want to talk a little bit later about the next step in their career. But they recorded 2 albums with Hourglass. Neither of them were very well received, and that sort of ended that little phase of their lives. That they were excellent musicians, excellent cover artists, spot on their changes, spot on chords, everything else. But they were lacking a sense of originality at this moment, and Greg wasn't yet a songwriter, so they were sort of stuck in this record company bubble.
So you kind of hinted at it there that, when the dissatisfaction sort of bubbled up, Duane left from California and ended up playing for a while at the Fame Studios. And I'm just curious, how did he end up there? And how did that shape him? Did it get him closer to what he wanted to do or help him figure out kind of the sound he was looking for?
This was a key kind of part of the development of the whole thing for multiple reasons. So the first thing I'll say this is, Duane just doesn't show up at Fame for the Wilson Pickett section in November of 1968. When Hourglass goes on their last tour, two really significant things happen for the Allman Brothers Band story. The first one, which we'll get to in a little bit, is Duane and Barry Oakley meet for the first time. But the second thing is, and around the same time, is they pool their money, the Hourglass does, and decide to go to Muscle Shoals Fame Studios, Rick Hall's studio, and record a demo. And they went there because Johnny Sandlin, who was Hourglass's drummer, had some experience in and around there recording. And they go and record several songs. One of them, probably the one that most folks know, is called the B.B. King Medley. And this speaks really quickly to them as a cover artist, because they literally played the first 3 tracks. I think it's the first 3 tracks from B.B. King's Live at the Regal. And B.B. King, the way he recorded live, the way he played live, is one song went into another, and that's what B.B. King Medley became. But it's awesome. I mean, Duane really, in particular, and Greg, you can hear the beginnings of Greg taming this massive voice he has as a 20-year-old kid, But they love. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I recall that back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was really discovering the Allman Brothers, and there was no internet, no way to do any of this kind of research, and just stumbled onto those Duane Allman tribute albums that came out, and stumbling onto that B.B. King medley, and just being just astonished and just thinking it was great.
It's a really key cog in the whole. A really key piece of the puzzle is that what he did with that. He could play the hell out of some B.B. King licks, man. And B.B. was one of his early models as a guitarist. And, you can hear that in Duane. Frankly, you can hear that in most of the guitarists in that band throughout their time, what they did. And then, of course, you got Greg, again, coming up with this, like, where did that voice come from, kind of thing. But they loved these demos, and they were really, really, really excited about them. You go back to L.A., and the record company basically says, this is crap, no way, you're not doing it. So this is where Duane, and I have quotes that involve a bunch of words you can't say on the radio, but he basically tells them to shove it, the record company, even though he's under contract, and he goes back to Florida. Kind of, I think, with his tail between his legs, because he's got no options, and he's under contract to Liberty Records. And he gets ticked. He's not happy. So in the meantime, he's back in Florida. Greg comes back for a little while, but Greg is it's pretty clear Greg was always going to go back to L.A. and fulfill the Liberty contract. And so Duane comes back. He ends up in and around Jacksonville. And there's a group of kind of hippie musicians, if you will. This is late. I mean, 69 is well after the Summer of Love and all the famous stuff. But this scene of musicians has kind of coalesced around a band called The Second Coming that includes Barry Oakley, who I mentioned, on bass, and Dickey on guitar. And these guys are crucial to the kind of next part of the story. So Duane's in and around Jacksonville just hanging out and playing music in a pretty vibrant little scene. And he gets a telegram asking him to come to Muscle Shoals. Now, this is interesting, Andy, because Rick Hall, until the day he died, and in the documentary that came out on Muscle Shoals, says that Duane just showed up in Muscle Shoals and pitched a pup tent in the parking lot and just wanted to stay. But I've got, an interview really with Barry. It's actually Barry Oakley who says that Duane does too, that, they got a telegram and Duane went up to Muscle Shoals from Jacksonville to record on a Wilson Pickett session. And I'm kind of figuring that Jimmy Johnson, who is a guitarist at Fame and was a producer, founded Muscle Shoals Sound. He was called, they were called the Swampers by Skynyrd, Ronnie Van Zant. He'd engineered those Hourglass demos. So I'm guessing Jimmy Johnson is the one who suggested, hey, you might want to bring this guy in. He's really pretty good. And I know we can't really get, too deep into this, but what really pushed Duane over the top was he convinces Wilson Pickett to record Hey Jude, which is the Beatles' top song at the time. And they record that version, which I think you played on your horn show a couple weeks ago.
Yep,
and
sure did.
This really put, like you said, how did Muscle Shoals figure into this? It did two things. I think one, which you don't see stated, but I think it's true, is Duane did the arrangement on that, and so it was a very unique arrangement of a pretty traditional song. It's vastly different what Wilson Pickett did on Hey Jude than the Beatles, right? There's a lot more oomph and power and everything else. I think the second thing was it put him on the map of Rick Hall and the music industry. Rick Hall was doing a lot of recording for Atlantic at the time. Wilson Pickett was on Atlantic, and they recognized it. And eventually Duane signs his first contract first with Rick Hall and then later with Phil Walden, who was Otis Redding's former manager, and that's kind of how all that goes. Duane has a contract in his pocket at this point, and he forms a band. That was his ultimate solution and answer.
So, Barry and Duane go off to Fame, and Barry plays on some of the songs that Duane was cutting for his solo album, which ultimately never came out but was released on those tribute albums I was mentioning earlier. And then they go back to Jacksonville, and that's when Duane really starts to jam with Barry and Dickey Betts in the Second Coming. And there are some low-ish quality audience tapes of those folks playing, and what they were able to do live, just like what Greg and Duane had been sort of famous for. Just great reputation as a live act. But whenever they'd get in the studio, they were always sort of forced to play some of the popular covers. And I'm going to play one of those here in a few minutes. But so, what did Duane see? What did he hear in them? And what did they, what did Barry and Dickey as a team bring to the band?
That to me is kind of one of the unsung parts of this equation I don't think gets quite enough play. One is what we have of Second Coming is a really poor audience tape that ostensibly came out shortly after the 50th anniversary of the Allman Brothers band when they formed, and then the two singles that we know. I think you'll play one of them. They were not a singles band, although Dickey has said for a long time the Allman Brothers band, the original, were very seasoned nightclub musicians. All of them had played on the circuit for a long time. What Barry and Dickey had was they had some sense of free form and freedom within that. It doesn't get captured really well on a 3-minute single. In fact, the Allman Brothers are never a singles band. That's another thing that's really unique about them is they were an album band, and the music industry was a singles industry until FM radio really takes off for the about the time Phil Maurice gets released. So back to your question, I tried really hard. I really wanted to put Barry Oakley a little more at the center of the story than he had been for a long time. Not for any other reason, but I think, Duane and his, power and spirit sort of overshadows everything in the early days. he's really about the only person who speaks on behalf of the band. Barry gets a little bit of play. And then Barry died so quickly after Duane died, and so tragically in the, another motorcycle accident, that it's a blip. But, the members will say it themselves, but I will tell you the things that I see. One is Dickey Betts himself always said Barry had so much insight and vision. He was the real visionary in the band, and he was talking about the Second Coming at that time. My notes are, his vision was a band unconstrained by playing these rote covers, and they developed original and improvisational arrangements of electric blues and rock, and it was very inspired. Barry is the link between the rock music of the South and the blues and the psychedelic music and the San Francisco sound that, was emanating several years earlier, for sure. And, when I think about two songs, when I think about what those two brought to it, the two immediate things that come to mind are Hoochie Coochie Man, which is a Muddy Waters song that my notes say, it's a pretty standard blues song, great blues song by Muddy. But it is, what the Allman Brothers did to that song is sped up, it's menacing, it's wonderful. And I really think that was Barry in arranging it, and it's so different than the Muddy song. And then the other is Don't Want You No More, which is an instrumental. It's a song. What's weird about Don't Want You No More to me is it was the B-side of a song that barely touched the charts. It was it hit number 100 for 1 week in 1967. It's not a very good song in my opinion. It's kind of simple and not that much, but they took it and made it an instrumental. And so they played the melody line on guitar, the vocal lines on guitars, and the version on that bootleg that you and I were talking about, that you mentioned earlier, is like 8 minutes long. But eventually they take it, cut it down to about, I think, 2.5 minutes, and they patch it to the front end of a song that Greg had written while he was in L.A. called It's Not My Cross to Bear, and he'd recorded a demo of it. And so they put those two together, and that became, for a long time, one of the two songs they would open shows with for many, many, many years. So what they brought, Dickey said, this is what they brought. Duane and Greg played a real honest, truthful, chilling delivery of urban blues, whereas Oakley and I may have been influenced by the blues and were students of it, but we were more innovative. We would try to take a blues tune and, instead of respecting the sacredness of it, we would go sideways with it. That's Hoochie Coochie Man for sure. So I think the sense of go ahead.
I was just going to say that's such a great quote. I just love that quote.
I do too. And I think it's funny. I spoke last night at an event, and it's hard to. I think he didn't say much over the years, and I had to look through about 40 years worth of his interviews to find where the little magical moments where he opened up a little bit here and there and spoke in a different way than, a lot of artists are very careful about how they express things, and some won't and don't for good reason. But it's fun when you see these things. And so I think, and what Dickey says too is, and this is, I think, really interesting, Barry and I were always missing something, a certain foundation, while Duane and Greg didn't quite have the adventurous kind of thing. So when we all came together, we gave each other a new foundation. And so the other thing I think that they bring is Barry's a third lead instrument. There's a quote, I'm not sure if it's apocryphal, Andy, I tried to find the source, but where it was a Dickey Betts quote, I think. We have 2 itty-bitty guitars and 1 big, huge guitar. Now all we need is a bass player. And I think that's just perfect because, when you listen, Barry is a third guitarist. And
if that's not a real quote, I want it to be a real quote because it really captures who they are and how they sound, especially live.
I'm going to look for it. In fact, I've been looking for it for a long time, and I couldn't verify the source, so I just had to let it go at this point. But yeah, it should be a real quote because it's true. And the thing is, 2 guitar bands of that era prior to '69, for the most part, 2 guitar bands were lead guitar and rhythm guitar. you did not have two lead guitarists in the same band, and you didn't have two of the best guitarists around in the same band. And I think Dickey brought a foil for Duane, and Dickey will say that. I mean, there's some things, you know, that I've seen him say about that, their relationship, which was, you know, Dickey almost uses like the term like a love affair. It's a really interesting way to say it. So I think that's what it was. It was a sense of adventurousness and taking music to different places, and I think that inspired Duane, and he used his contract. I stopped so you could edit that part out.
Uh-huh. Yep.
So he left he had a contract, and he put together something different than what the band itself expected. Than what Phil Walden and Atlantic Records and all them had expected, completely. It was a completely different concept altogether. And, you know, that I think they offered for Duane something different than he had ever imagined.
Speaking of something different than what most folks are offering, Duane insisted, two drummers. I want two drummers in this band. What was going on with that? What was he trying to accomplish? And how did J-Mo and Butch Trucks play differently but also play together? I mean, that's, you know, I listened to those guys and I could hear it, but I mean, how did Duane hear it before it ever happened?
You know, that probably always will remain a mystery. You know, so J-Mo was the first official member of the new project. You could say that Barry was the first he met outside of Craig, his brother. I'm sorry. It was Craig, then Butch, then Barry. But Barry was the first I think he had his eye on, and he'd been trying to get Barry to join this project. And as you said, he had recorded some with him in Muscle Shoals on his solo, you know, album. J-Mo went to Muscle Shoals from Macon, where he had joined up with the burgeoning, became the Capricorn milieu, if you will. J-Mo went out there and started playing. But, you know, the idea of the band was it was going to be a power trio like Jimi Hendrix Experience or Cream or something like that. And J-Mo is a great drummer. But J-Mo himself said, I would never have been the right guy for that. I was never a power drummer. J-Mo also says Duane was talking about two guitars and two drummers from the start. It was just finding the right guys. So you get that question, right? How did he hear it before anybody else did? You know, he said he wanted two drummers to J-Mo because James Brown had two drummers. But James Brown didn't use two drummers at the same time. One guy would sit behind his set while the other guy would drum, and then they basically, I don't know if they took turns all night, but they would switch songs. They didn't play at the same time. You know, what Dickey said about J-Mo is J-Mo was a great drummer, and once we all got in there, it was bigger, and he wasn't really able to handle the power. It wasn't his style. We needed Butch, who had that drive and strength. And I think, you know, the difference between the two is Butch's nickname is the Freight Train. He is a powerful, powerful drummer, was a powerful drummer, and a monster. And Butch was the one who could keep really a great in-the-pocket player. He could just sit in the pocket and hold it. And then he was really the only musician in the band with a lot of formal training. He had a lot of formal training. J-Mo is a jazz drummer. He's very much cut from the Elvin Jones school of drumming. Elvin Jones was John Coltrane's drummer for a long time. And, you know, if you ever had the privilege of watching him with the Allman Brothers, J-Mo's doing things that you really don't hear until you can watch him and hear it at the same time, because he's always embellishing. How they work together, Andy, even they have long said it just was immediate. They fit together perfectly. They never stepped on each other the way that they worked. I think it was just a matter of the right combination, the right people at the right time. And so that's, you know, I think they give, you know, the only other band at the time that was significant with two drummers was the Grateful Dead, and they work out their parts. Mickey Hart and Kreisman work out their parts. The Allman Brothers don't. Derek Tedeschi Trucks band uses two drummers now, Derek being Butch's nephew who, you know, retired with the band in 2014. and they use two drummers also, but very few do. And I think it gives you a body, sound, and a bass line from which you can launch all kinds of cool things too. And I think that's pretty damn cool.
To me, it's a lot easier to hear on some of the earlier live stuff that didn't get quite the same production treatment that Live at Fillmore East. I mean, if you listen to the Ludlow stuff, if you listen to the recent release on from the Fillmore 1970, where it's not quite as mixed, I think that the drums stand out in the mix a little higher, and you can hear that. And one thing I noticed just recently, I'm always discovering new things about this band, is that they use the snare so significantly different. And on that rare occasion when both of them hit the snare at the same time, it's just like magic in my ears.
Yeah. I listened last night to the Mountain Jam from 9/16/71 at the Warehouse, and exactly what you said, Andy. That the way the sound was, it's a couple microphones stuck in the rafters, so the sound is, it's not compressed in a bad way, but it's not like you're listening to a well-produced album. It's somewhat like being in concert, and the drums were just they were washing over me in such an amazing way. And J-Mo, he played a lot different in the original band era than he later did when they added a percussionist, Mark Quinones. J-Mo has said it. He changed what he did to fit. That's just how he is as a musician and as a person, I would imagine, But it was something completely different, and it was powerful stuff when the mix was right, and the mix, not in the sound mix way, but when the group and the people were together.
So, March 26, 1969, Greg gets back from the West Coast, gets into Jacksonville, and sits in with a group of guys that Duane had been jamming with, and they become the Allman Brothers.
Yes.
What made them unique? What made them, I mean, you kind of hit at this quite a bit, but I just thought I'd ask it directly. I mean, how were they different? What made them unique? What did they have there?
So let's set up where we are in this. So March 23rd, 1969, 50 years ago, a group of 6 guys gets together and they begin a jam at a place called the Gray House in Jacksonville's Riverside neighborhood. And these musicians it's Duane, it's Barry, it's Dickey, it's J-Mo and Butch, and then Reese Winans is on keyboards. Now Reese was in a band. I think Reese was in the Second Coming. Could be mistaken on that, but Reese was in and around doing things. Reese knew he wasn't going to be in the band because when they finished, Duane says famously, "Anybody in this room not going to play in my band, you're going to have to fight your way out." And of course, no one moves. And Duane calls Greg. Now, there's a lot of stories about this. Like, did Duane always have Greg in mind? Which J-Mo says yes. Duane and Greg were estranged at the time. Greg had left to go to L.A. instead of following Duane in this new path. They apparently had not been getting along real well, but Linda Oakley, Barry's wife, says Duane would continue to say, "My brother's in a bad situation. We got to get him back." And they kept the band all knew Greg because they'd all run the same circuit, And they said, "You need to call your brother. You need to call your brother." J-Mo says he was always going to call Greg. So Duane calls Greg and says, quote, the cats love to play. They're all really into their instruments. They sing a little bit, but there's not a whole lot of writing going on. So I need you to come and sing and write and round it all up and send it in some sort of direction. Now, Greg said to the day he died, it was the finest compliment I ever heard. So that gets us back to then Greg walking in the room. There's a famous quote Dickie Betts said where Greg walked in the room they were playing, and Greg sort of backed up against the wall and said, "Jesus Christ, what a band." And Greg was like, "I don't think I can hack it." And Duane apparently gave him some crap for that, and they did it. So let's all just say, setting up your question. I will say, go on the record, they were the only band doing what they did. And I'd argue really the only band who ever did really what they did, the formula that they did. There were a lot of bands of virtuosos, but not a lot in the rock idiom. A lot of that was in jazz or jazz fusion. So you get like any of Miles Davis's bands. The most recent in this era is the Bitches Brew Band. John McLaughlin had the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Tony Williams had Lifetime. These are virtuoso musicians. There's no vocals. It's just great rock-infused jazz or jazz-infused rock. And so, one of the things is these are instrumental virtuosos playing all these forms of music pretty seamlessly, and doing so with this amazing vocalist who is beyond, belief, especially once he harnesses his voice, a little bit later. I say really what makes them different is they're playing American music. It is something completely new there. And really the jazz element, I think, is what really makes them stand out. They're improvisers, just like jazz musicians are, but they're improvisers along a melody or a theme. They're not just going out there noodling around. There was a real dedication to their craft. These weren't just burnt-out hippies who were playing music and enjoying each other's company. Colonel Bruce Hampton has a great quote where he said, they were on fire. The intent of the essence were there. It was just pure as hell. You could feel the purity in the fire and the intensity. Nobody was playing checkers or talking business. This was music for music's sake. And, I think the other big part of this, and it gets left off a lot, it sort of gets rolled into other stories, is they were Southerners and they stayed in the South. All of their music is Southern influenced. All of their influences are Southern musically, and most of it is African American origins, really, with the exception of country, which has a lot of African American influences. So they did it from the South, and they stayed in the South, and I think that's a really interesting part of the equation. Unfortunately, it gets lumped into the Southern rock stereotype, which they're a part of. They're just not a part of in this original era.
So you were talking earlier about, and I asked you about, Dickey's influence on the band's sound, and I've heard more than one person whose opinion I greatly respect talk about Duane Allman's solo in memory of Elizabeth Reed on the Fillmore East album as being the greatest rock and roll guitar solo ever played. And you don't have to agree with that. It's certainly great music. But that's a particularly important song. And what did that do? How did Dickey, what did that do to the band's sound?
There's two songs that I would say are sui generis for them. Liz Reed is one, the other is Dreams. It's something they do that nobody else does. So let's sort of unpack this a little bit. First of all, this is amazing. This was Dickey's kind of first songwriting effort. And that's really amazing to me. Like, that song came that way. Dickey was a great guitarist and arranger, and it turned out he was a really gifted composer. And I don't know that this was anything that anybody knew when they started. But, what J-Mo said at the time is he was kind of hesitant to share them. Dickey was somewhat insecure about it, apparently. And as J-Mo said, he thought that worked to his advantage because he'd have something almost perfect before he'd bring it to the band. Memory of Elizabeth Reed, I think, really brings in the jazz element, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Dickey, and the band itself. It's got multiple movements in it. Multiple solos. It has a chance for every instrumentalist, everybody to solo, although the drums are doing it in tandem. They're not really soloing, if you will. And Barry Oakley doesn't drop out to do a solo, but he is playing lead lines on bass the entire time. It really does come out pretty fully formed right out of the chute. I mean, the first recorded examples we have are those February Fillmore East shows, February 1970. And it's pretty well done. They just keep honing it until you get the version the next year that everybody knows so well. And Dickey always knew how special that song was. I had this great quote that I came across. It said, "When I write something that I'm proud of, like Elizabeth Reed, where does that melody come from? Do you think I write one note after another saying, oh boy, this is catchy? He says, no, that melody is given to me because I've dedicated myself so much to that guitar. Where it comes from, I do know, although I will not say." So I just think it's fantastic.
That's a great quote. I hadn't heard that one.
So I think that this is a chance for them to stretch out their jazz chops, to build on some other things that they were doing. And unlike Don't Want You No More, which is an instrumental cover that they made their own, this is a song instrumental that they take from beginning to end, and it's basically one long improvisation with road markers that is the melody and the changes in the tune. And other bands do that, had done it. I think they just did it to a different level. The closest thing you can get again is really the jazz fusion bands. And it became a hallmark of the bands, the instrumentals. The Dickey, most of them written by Dickey bands.
So you mentioned Dreams as one of the two most important songs, along with In Memory of Elizabeth Reed. Why do you say that? I mean, and if you had to pick a particular version, what version would you pick from that original Six era?
So I'll say that I think Dreams and Liz Reed are really the two things that they do that no one else really touches. The other things they do, other bands do. I don't think they do them as well, but you could argue that they do them as well or better. So one of our acquaintances from the old listserv, we talked about Gary Barrett, huge jazz fan, once asked me, he said, what one song from Fillmore East would you say is representative of the Allman Brothers? Like, would you say, here, listen to this, this will show you? And I struggled with that question for about 24 hours because I'm a dork like that, and I might have even struggled it might have even taken me longer, but I came up with 6 different songs. Well, first of all, you can't use Fillmore East because Fillmore East is missing 3 of the 6 that I'm about to mention. So number one, they're excellent at shorter, tight blues songs. Statesboro Blues is probably the one I would use because it was the song Duane Allman learned to play slide guitar to, what inspired them. But One Way Out and Done Somebody Wrong, Don't Keep, all these other amazing songs. Then these longer blues where they would take Junior Wells's You Don't Love Me and turn it into a 19-minute epic, or Bobby Blue Bland's version of Stormy Monday. In this case, the longer blues song I would take, and I think this is probably the most representative, is Whipping Post from at Fillmore East, 22 minutes. It's got all the jazz that you need, and it's got Greg's vocals. Country-wise,
hard to top that version of Whipping Post, but it's hard to fit a 22-minute song into a 2-hour radio show.
Well, we have been having this discussion by text off and on, right?
Yes, sir. And absolutely.
You can get that 5-minute version on the first album, and it's good. But yeah, the joke they always said when the radio programmers in the 60s, in the 60s and 70s needed to go to the bathroom, they would just put on that Whipping Post and go do their thing because they had 22 minutes to kill. So you don't have that in this thing.
Right.
From a country perspective, that doesn't emerge until it starts a little bit with Revival and Midnight Rider. I think both of them have some very country leanings. Dickey's playing consistently carries it. He plays major pentatonic licks, which is a very country sound, but it's Blue Sky is representative. Of course, that's not on Fillmore East. Jazz instrumentals, definitely Liz Reed, but you can trace, a line of great instrumentals from them. I still think High Falls might be Dickey's finest composition, although I can't put it above Liz Reed because of Liz Reed. I mentioned Dreams. The thing about Dreams is like something from Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. It's got vocals though, and apparently, I think Alan Paul's book says this. Barry did that arrangement, so Greg brought it in more of a ballad like Melissa maybe, and they turned it into that waltz time, pretty languid, beautiful jam. And then, my license plate is Mountain Jam. Everything else, this true improvisational piece that they were the only ones who did it, but a lot of others did it, but the way they did it was completely different. My favorite Dreams, as you mentioned. I don't think the studio version is phenomenal. I don't remember if you've played it yet or not. My favorite version is from the last decent recording we have of Duane Allman from September 19th, 1971 at SUNY Stony Brook, and that's a 19-minute version that includes some back and forth with Dickey, which Oh man, Andy, like a great what if would be what if those two had traded licks in Dreams and that had become a 20-minute showstopper, like golly. I think that we talked today, in advance, just given time, the version from Ludlow Garage, which opens up that set, it was April of 1970. It was kind of the first quote-unquote bootleg I had. It was an official release, but real gritty, and, apparently that club was really very gritty too. And so, that's the version that I love them all, but I just truly love that one. That's the song that for me, every era of the band, which I know we're not talking about today, but if they could hit that song right, and they all did, I was happy with whatever was going on stage, because that song is what sets them apart. And I need to say, for the record, that was very clear when I did my research, when I was looking at what's called reception, audience reception, and critical reception. They all recognized Dreams as being a very special song in the Allman Brothers Band's repertoire. And that came out, well, Greg brought it with him from California. That's one of his famous sayings.
It's, I just can't imagine that as a ballad. I'm really glad Barry decided to switch that up into that walk down, because I just, because it's such there's it's like there's some nightmares going on there. It's not just dreams. I don't think you'd hear that in a ballad.
In a true, traditional ballad, absolutely. And, I think we had a talk, you and I were chatting about this the other day, and, Tedeschi Trucks Band has played it now twice in this spring tour, and the second time they played it, I think that, there's, when you listen to the lyrics of Dreams, you're like, man, how does a 21-year-old guy come out with something like that at 21? I mean, I could barely, open a beer can, much less pour my soul out like that in words, fully finished. And then his brother plays this solo, and I can't remember how you and I phrased it, but it was, and Derek channels this. Warren Haynes did for years. Jack Pearson did. They all did. But in this one version of this song, I think you said, like, Derek sees that. He saw the same place. You can say it.
Yeah, well, I can't remember exactly what I said either, Bob, but I know that, I think that even, Derek even changed his tone somewhat for that particular version that you're referring to, and it sounded a whole lot closer to Duane's original tone. And I think their tones are very similar, but I can definitely hear differences. But on that song, he was in that same space that Duane was when he played that song.
He was.
Yeah, I thought it was beautiful.
He was channeling, something there, which is what music can and does do. It's it does transcend words. And, I think the idea was, Derek had just lost a bandmate and a good friend in Kofi Burbridge, and, he felt the same sense of tragedy and loss that Duane was feeling as he played, but he also felt redemption in the music to work his way out of it, And so I think that is a very good part of the discussion, and, sort of what he brought to the equation.
So, Bob, we're going to run out of time here, and I'm betting you're getting close to get on your airplane. Anything else you'd like folks to know about that original 6 era of the Allman Brothers? Any quotes, fun stories, or anything?
No, I'm going to sort of leave you with two of them. That one of the big ones is, I'm going to start with a thing that sets them apart. And this came from Tom Dowd, who was the producer of At Fillmore East and Layla, and, before that, John Coltrane and Ray Charles and everything else. But he said about the Allman Brothers, they had a very strong groove with jazz permutations and elements of blues, and then they could rock. Nobody represented this type of dynamic change, and the audience was ready for it. There were groups that could play the blues, jazz, and hard rock, but none could put all these elements together in one song. And I think that's a really great reflection on the band and what he worked on. And one of the things that Dowd mentions is audience, and I think this is a really important part of the equation. Something I'm actually, of all the things I wrote on, I'm really proud of the chapter I wrote on what's called audience reception, because it hadn't been done before, and I was able to find this. But Dickey makes a quote about the audience, and he says, the Allman Brothers Band would never have made it without that particular attitude of the audience who wanted to hear the improvisation and the individual expression of each different band member. The audience, by the way, this is Bob saying, mattered to the band. Dickey said, we weren't any different from the people we played for, except we were a band, and there was a bond between us. And I think that's really, you can hear it. It's really true in the music the band played, and in the things that they said, and in the way that they were received by the audience. They were one of us, if you will, is the way that audience members reflected.
Well, Bob, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this stuff, and we're going to have to find a concert or something to go to together here in the near future.
Yeah, I think there's a show in Cincinnati in July that we were talking about trying to do. So
I do think we did mention that.
So listen, it's always a pleasure, and your radio show is appointment listening when I'm near a thing, just because it's always good to listen to your friends talk and tell stories. I hope that some people, become interested and dig a little deeper in this story. I think it's a fascinating story, and music is great. Great for that.
All right.
Thanks. All right, man. Take care, Andy.
Take care.